By the summer of 1941, the German paratrooper, the Fallschirmjäger, had become the Wehrmacht's most potent symbol of elite status and tactical innovation. They had secured decisive victories in Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, most famously seizing the seemingly impregnable fortress of Eben Emael with a mere 78 men. But military prestige in the 20th century was a precarious currency, often devalued by the very victories that created it. For the Fallschirmjäger, the tactics that made them legendary also contained the seed of their operational destruction. The storm from above was about to break itself against the geography of Crete. The parachute was not a means of insertion but an instrument of dispersal. To understand the Fallschirmjäger is to understand the technical limitations that define them. The standard German parachute of the era, the RZ series, was not a steerable canopy. It was designed for stability, not control. A jumper had no control over his direction or his landing point. He was basically just a passenger of the wind and the aircraft's drop speed. More critically, the parachute was rigged to a static line inside the plane, so, when the jumper exited, the line pulled the parachute from its pack. This system dictated the exit posture, a clumsy, head-first dive, and, crucially, meant the heavy, single-point harness left the soldier hanging face down, unable to rotate or maneuver. He was entirely vulnerable during the descent, a slow-moving target for ground fire. This technical reality forced a doctrinal shift. Because you couldn't land on your objective, you had to land near it. The German airborne concept relied on what they called Truppenweisung, the wide dispersal of troops across a drop zone. The individual paratrooper was not part of a precise strike force upon landing, but rather a single piece of a scattered puzzle. His primary job in the first minutes was not to attack, but to locate his weapons container. The rifle, the machine gun, the ammunition, all were dropped in separate canisters to reduce weight on the jumper. This left the freshly landed soldier armed only with a pistol and a knife, forced to sprint across an open field under fire to retrieve the tools of his trade. This vulnerability was an accepted risk, a calculated gamble that surprise and speed would outweigh the inherent chaos of the landing. The invasion of Crete was, honestly, a masterclass in tactical surprise that strategic intelligence just failed to support. Operation Merkur, the airborne invasion of Crete in May of 1941, was actually the first time the Fallschirmjäger were used in their intended strategic role, the conquest of an island. The plan was, well, audacious. German intelligence, however, operated more on assumption than on fact. They estimated the garrison to be weakly held by just a few thousand demoralized Greek and British troops, many of whom were assumed to be withdrawing. In reality, though, the island's defenders numbered over 40,000. Crucially, the Allied commander, General Bernard Freyberg, had been tipped off to the invasion by ultra-intelligence intercepts. He knew the date and the general plan, but, honestly, he simply lacked the resources to defend every possible landing zone. The primary drop zones, at Malem, Rethymno, and Heraklion, were therefore not surprises at all. They were killing grounds. As the slow Ju-52 transport aircraft came into range, they were met by a curtain of disciplined, pre-sighted fire. The dispersal that was a standard feature of German doctrine became, well, a fatal liability. Jaegers were shot in their harnesses. Those who landed were often cut down before they could even reach the weapons canisters. The 7th Parachute Division, the elite of the German army, was being decimated in the first hours of the operation. The storm from above was being shattered on the rocks below. The battle was ultimately won by a single airfield and a decision made by a junior officer who refused to wait for orders. By the afternoon of the first day, the situation was catastrophic for the Germans. At Rethymno and Heraklion, the assaults had been contained and repulsed with heavy losses. The only glimmer of hope was at Malem airfield. Here, the paratroopers had secured a foothold on a hill overlooking the airstrip, but the airfield itself remained under the enfilading fire of a single New Zealand battalion. The Luftwaffe's ability to land reinforcements was the only way to salvage the operation. But as long as that machine gun fire swept the runway, the heavy transport planes could not land. What turned the tide was a decision made in the chaos of the front line. Major Walter Koch, a veteran of Eben Emael, recognized that the Hill 107, was the key. As night fell, the New Zealand defenders, having suffered significant casualties and misreading the situation, withdrew. They assumed they were being outflanked. They were not, but the German officer on the spot, a company commander who saw the hill fall silent, did not hesitate. He advanced and occupied the position without waiting for orders from his decimated battalion headquarters. By first light, German machine guns were looking down the length of the airfield. The Luftwaffe immediately began crash-landing troops and heavy equipment onto the beach next to the runway, under fire. The Mountain Division troops who stumbled off those planes were not elite paratroopers, but they were fresh infantry with rifles and mortars. The balance of the battle had tipped, not by a grand strategic design, but by a single, decisive local action. Crete became a Pyrrhic victory that permanently grounded the German airborne arm. The cost of capturing Crete was horrifying. Over 6,000 Fallschirmjäger were killed or wounded, roughly one-third of the total force committed. So many Ju-52s were damaged by ground fire that the Luftwaffe's transport capacity was crippled for months. It was a victory, but one that sent a clear message to the German high command. In a meeting shortly after the battle, Adolf Hitler famously declared that the day of the paratrooper is over. He was stunned by the casualty rates, viewing mass airborne drops as an unsustainable luxury. The consequence was immediate and absolute. The Fallschirmjäger would never again be used in a large-scale airborne assault. For the rest of the war, they were employed as elite light infantry, fighting with distinction and brutality in Russia, North Africa, and Italy. They fought on the defensive at Monte Cassino, not dropping from the sky but digging into mountainside rubble. The unique capability they had pioneered, vertical envelopment, was abandoned by the very army that invented it. The Allies, observing Crete, drew the opposite conclusion. They saw the immense potential of airborne forces, but understood that success required solving the problems Crete had exposed: better intelligence, organic heavy weapons, and, most importantly, gliders and steerable parachutes to deliver troops directly onto the objective, rather than scattering them across a drop zone. The story of the German paratrooper at Crete is a lesson in the fragility of tactical innovation. A revolutionary tool, used in isolation against a prepared enemy, can shatter the hand that wields it. The courage and adaptability of the individual soldier on Hill 107 could salvage a single battle, but it could not change the strategic reality that the parachute as a weapon system had been pushed beyond its limits. Remembering this isn't about celebrating the event, but about understanding that in war, the difference between a decisive weapon and a catastrophic failure is often measured in seconds, in intelligence failures, and in the decisions made by a few men on a nameless hill. If you value in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond the simple summaries, consider subscribing to War Machiner. Share this video with someone who appreciates the complex, often overlooked realities of conflict.